Once upon a time, in the midst of the turbulent days of ancient Israel, there was a woman no one expected to remember. Her name was Rispa. She was the daughter of Aiah, a woman from a simple background but who ended up right at the center of power, as King Saul's concubine. She wasn't a wife, she wasn't a servant. She was in a strange place where love was protocol and respect optional. She lived in the palace between stone columns and cold corridors. She saw the king's heavy footsteps, the whispers of war, and the advisors fawning over whoever had the crown. And there, in the midst of the coming and going of soldiers, prophets and alliances, Rispa became almost invisible. But even in this place of shadow, she had two sons with Saul, Armoni and Mephibosheth, two boys born with royal blood, but with no guarantee of a throne or a future. In those days, sons of concubines didn't have much prestige. They were remembered when it mattered, forgotten when they got in the way. And Rispa knew it. Even so, she cared for them, as if every beat of their hearts was a miracle. Subscribe to the channel for more exciting Bible stories and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any videos. If this content touches your heart and you want to support us, feel free to click on the Thanks a Lot button. All help is welcome and makes a big difference. She wasn't the protagonist of any battle. She didn't have visions, she didn't talk to angels, she didn't lead any people. But that's where her story begins to surprise. Because while the people's eyes were on Saul's wars, David's strategies and Samuel's words, Rispa was there, quietly, watching, waiting, and living on the edge between being remembered and being erased. In the palace, time passed slowly for someone who had neither crown nor voice. Rispa lived there, among tapestries hanging on the walls and conversations that she only heard from afar. It was a discreet presence, almost like the sound of the wind coming through a crack. It was there, but no one really noticed. The concubines lived in a secluded corner, away from important eyes. They weren't treated like queens, nor did they have the privileges of wives chosen by alliance. They were part of everyday life, but not of official history. And Rispa knew exactly where she stood. Even so, she paid attention to everything. The soldiers who came home dirty from battle, the nervous glances of the servants, the nights when Saul walked restlessly like someone carrying ghosts. She also watched her children grow up. Armoni, with a serious manner. Mephibosheth, more restless. Two boys who, even though they were Aiah's grandchildren, carried Saul's name in their blood, which was a burden, not a privilege. Deep down, she knew that royal blood could be a blessing or a curse, depending on who was on the throne. Sometimes, while combing the hair of one of her sons or preparing some simple food, Rispa would hear rumors. They spoke of David, the popular warrior, of the wars that never ended, the tension between the tribes. Saul was getting old, and his enemies were everywhere, inside and outside the walls. And when the king slept badly, the whole house shook in silence. It was in this atmosphere of uncertainty that Rispa raised her children, knowing that their world could turn upside down at the snap of a finger. When Saul fell in battle against the Philistines, the cry that echoed through the camp was not just one of pain. It was the end. The king, who started out humble and ended up lost, died with a sword stuck in his own body. And with him, his eldest sons also died. The throne, which was already fragile, was now in pieces. Israel became an open field for dispute. David, already anointed by Samuel years before, took the throne with the support of Judah. But not everyone was ready to forget Saul. There were resentments, old alliances, memories that were hard to bury. The house of Saul still breathed in quiet corners of the kingdom, and the names of his descendants were whispered between agreements and threats. Rispa, who had never had anything to do with the wars, felt the mood change. Suddenly, her eyes turned to her sons. Armoni and Mephibosheth, who used to run around the palace corridors like any child, were now seen as risks. Two boys, already men, carrying a surname that many people wanted to erase. It wasn't long before the power struggle was no longer just between the living. The past became a debt, and where there's debt, someone ends up paying, even if they're not to blame. People began to disappear. Some of Saul's former allies disappeared overnight, others were exiled or kept quiet. It was as if the new government was cleaning house, sweeping away the last memories of the old king. And while David was trying to establish his reign, an even older tragedy was hanging in the sky. A 3-year famine was ravaging the people. Dry land, withered crops, skinny children. 3 years, that's how long the sky closed in on Israel. No rain, no harvest, no relief. It was as if the earth was angry, refusing everything. The people fasted, cried out, made sacrifices, but nothing changed. Then David, already on the throne, decided to ask God what was wrong, and the answer came as dry as cracked ground. Saul was to blame. More precisely, what he did to the Gibeonites. The Gibeonites were a foreign people who had made an ancient agreement with Israel, a pact of peace sealed in the days of Joshua. Only Saul, driven by misguided zeal, tried to exterminate them. A betrayal, a sin that had been stored up and which, even after Saul's death, still weighed heavy in heaven. David went to the Gibeonites to find a way to make amends. He wanted to know what they asked for in exchange for peace. And here came the icy reply: 7 descendants of Saul, 7 men of his blood, publicly hanged. They didn't want gold or land. They wanted justice, their way. David accepted, not out of malice, but because he was trying to save an entire kingdom. And there, in the middle of the list, were Rispah's 2 sons, Armoni and Mephibosheth. There was no trial, no defense, no chance of explanation. They were taken one by one to Gibeah. They were hung on a hill, exposed to the wind and the sun, with no right to a grave. And all this happened during the beginning of the barley harvest, as if the lives of some were the price for feeding others. The scene was too harsh, even for eyes accustomed to war. 7 bodies hanging on a hill, in the middle of an open field, without a grave, without honor. Among them, Armoni and Mephibosheth, Rispah's sons. The wind was blowing cold and constant. Birds of prey began to prowl, flying in circles in the sky, as if waiting for the right time. The animals of the field came at night, guided by the smell of death. And then, there she was, Rispa. She went up to the hill with a sackcloth, a symbol of mourning and humiliation, and spread it on a rock. That became her home, not for a day, not for a week. She stayed there for months. From the beginning of the barley harvest to the beginning of the rain at the end of the season. During the day, she chased the vultures away with her hands, with screams, with stones. At night, he watched the ground with wide eyes, scanning the darkness for anything that came near. Her arms got tired, her eyes stung, but she kept going. There was no tent, no shelter. The sun beat down on her face. The cold of the early morning cut into her skin, and she was there, silently, like a sentinel of pain. She had nothing to offer but her presence. But in that place of abandonment, that was all. People started whispering about the woman who wouldn't leave the hill. Some said it was madness, others said it was faith. But whoever passed by felt something strange, as if that silence spoke louder than any prayer. Time passed, and Rispa was still there. The sun rose, burned the ground, fell again at the end of the day, and she kept going. Her body must have been aching, her feet cracked, her eyes red from crying and watching. But she kept going. There were days when she didn't even look human. She looked like a statue of pain sculpted by longing. Passers-by would look at her from a distance and stop. Some didn't know whether to go to her or turn back. It was a heart-rending scene, a woman sitting in front of the bodies of her children, struggling with animals, time and silence. But what no one said out loud, everyone felt. It was a protest, a scream without sound. Rispa was showing the whole kingdom that her dead had a name, a face, a story. They weren't numbers or political justice. They were her children, And if no one was going to honor their memory, she was going to do it herself. The story took off. Someone told someone else, who told someone else, until the story reached the palace. King David heard it. A servant whispered in his ear what was happening on that forgotten hill. David stopped. Just imagine, the king surrounded by plans, soldiers, decisions of state, now hearing about a woman alone who wouldn't leave the place where her children had been left to rot in the open. It wasn't an order. It wasn't a warning from God. It was Rispa's silence that touched the king. The firmness of a mother who didn't move. And that's what made David get up, call his men, and take an action he should have taken a long time ago. David ordered everything to stop. The war, the councils, the court engagements. Nothing seemed more urgent than that woman sitting on a rock. He listened carefully to the full story, the months Rispa had spent watching over the bodies of her sons, the rain that had not yet come, the silence that had not been broken. The king, who had previously handed over those men out of political necessity, now realized the weight of what had been done. They weren't just the sons of Rispa. They were the children of Israel, Aiah's grandchildren, descendants of a king who, though fallen, had his history. David felt the blow. It was as if every day of Rispa on that hill had nudged a part of his conscience that had been lying dormant. Then he stood up and gave an order, not to kill, but to collect. He sent for the bones of Saul and Jonathan, which had been lying in the territory of the Philistines since the Battle of Mount Gilboa. He also ordered them to collect the remains of the 7 hanged men, including those of Armoni and Mephibosheth. Everything was done carefully. The bones were gathered, cleaned, and prepared. Finally, the dead would be laid to rest. The people watched and remained silent. It was unusual for the king to stop everything to look after dead bodies. But in this case, they weren't just bodies, they were wounded memories. David ordered that they all be buried together in a tomb belonging to Saul's family, in Zelah, in the land of Benjamin. A dignified burial, the way it should have been from the beginning. The land that had previously rejected everything now received the bones with respect. Meanwhile, Rispa continued up the hill. She didn't know what the king was doing, but her mourning continued. And deep down, something deeper was born there, a strength that no one expected from someone who had always been seen as invisible. The procession moved down the dirt tracks with a different weight. It wasn't the weight of bones, it was the weight of delay, the shame of a mourning that should have happened much earlier. Men carried the remains of Saul, Jonathan, and the 7 hanged men. They passed villages, fields, and watchful eyes that remembered well who they had been. The inhabitants of Zelah were silent when they saw them coming. There was no celebration, no praise, no speeches, only respect. The bodies were buried in Saul's family tomb, finally together, finally honored. The dust of war, revenge, hunger, all began to settle there in that simple gesture to lay the dead to rest. And although no one said it out loud, everyone knew why. It wasn't an order from God. It wasn't a political plan. It was a woman who sat for days and nights, months on end, facing the bodies of her children, facing crows, jackals, and her own loneliness. Rispa's gesture was like a seed planted in the desert. It didn't shout, but it echoed. And without having to get up from her rock, she moved the king. The men who took part in the burial came back, telling us how David had changed. Quieter, slower, like he was carrying a regret that didn't fit in his chest. They say he watched the grave being closed and kept his eyes downcast, as if he could hear, deep down in his soul, Saul's footsteps, Jonathan's words, the weeping of Rispa's sons. But the weather, the same weather that made the earth dry up, began to change. The sky, closed for so long, showed its first signs, a more humid breeze, the smell of rain coming from far away. And while the people looked up, waiting for the sky to open, Rispa remained there, firm, because her story wasn't over yet. She didn't ask for a statue. She didn't apologize. She didn't even ask for justice. Rispa just stayed, and staying At that time, in that place, in the face of everything that had happened, was a giant act. While many ran for answers, she responded with silence. While others sought alliances, she planted her feet on the rock. Her grief became more than sadness. It became resistance, and more than resistance. She became a mirror. Anyone who looked at her saw something they'd rather avoid: the consequences of haste, of cold politics, of death treated as a number. Rispa was just a woman, a concubine, no one with a title. But what she did on that hill touched everything. Her gesture became a symbol, not the kind of symbol you embroider on a flag, but the kind that marks your soul. Someone who spends months chasing away vultures to protect her dead children isn't just crying. They're saying, without saying it, they're worth more than the fate you gave them. It was a protest without a sign, a cry without a sound. The old men of the village, the soldiers, even the toughest servants, they all heard about the woman who wouldn't stop. Some stopped at a distance, left food and water. Others just bowed their heads and followed. But the fact is that no one could ignore her. She, who never had a throne, won a gesture of honor from the king himself. She, who was born on the margins, became the center of a movement she didn't even know was starting. Because there, on that forgotten piece of land, Rispa was not only burying children, she was unearthing truths that time had tried to hide. After the bodies were buried and the rain finally fell on Israel, Rispa simply disappeared. No one knows for sure where she went or when she came down from the hill. No line in scripture says whether she was taken in, forgotten, or chose to live in hiding. The silence that marked her pain also surrounded her end. Some say she returned to her home, what was left of it. Others say she stayed right there, like a shadow walking through the fields, looking at the sky. Whatever the version, what remained was the image. People who saw it haven't forgotten it. The woman sitting on a rock, her face marked by the sun and the pain, holding on tight to the memory of her children. The woman who scared away vultures like someone who scares away the indifference of the world, who stayed there, planted, as if the ground itself could only breathe because she didn't let death take everything. Some stories end with victories, crowns, and miracles. Rispa's ended the way most lives end, quietly but with a mark so strong that it crossed generations. She wasn't part of the wars, but she faced the worst one of all, the one that happens inside the soul. She didn't stand up with a sword, but she held her grief so firmly that no one dared take what was left of her. And even without a word written about her last days, her every gesture still counts. It still inspires, it still teaches. Because of everything Rispa lost, the one thing she never let go of was her dignity. Some people mark the world with words, speeches, and victories. Rispa made her mark with silence, with resistance, with presence. And sometimes that's what's missing, someone who stays, who doesn't run away when everything collapses. She wasn't a prophetess, a warrior, or a judge. She didn't work miracles. She didn't write psalms. But what she did there on that hill was as powerful as any heroic deed. Rispa showed that a mother's love does not end in death, that dignity does not depend on position, and that there are struggles that can be won just by not giving up. Her story spans the centuries because it speaks to those who have already lost, to those who have been ignored. It speaks to those who have had to pick up the pieces with no one around. It speaks to those who just wanted justice, or at least respect, and had to learn to resist in the midst of abandonment. Rispa teaches that not every cry needs to be loud. That faith sometimes shows itself in the form of stubbornness, the stubbornness not to go away, not to forget, not to let the pain turn to dust before it is recognized. She faced the crows with her hands. She faced time with her body. She faced loneliness with courage, not to change the whole world, but to protect the memory of her own. And in the end, she changed more than she could have imagined, because it was because of her that a king remembered what was right, that bones were collected, names were once again respected. So when we think of faith, courage, or love, it's good to remember Rispa, the woman who stayed, who cried in silence, and who, although invisible to so many, became eternal for those who know what really matters. If you liked Rispa's story and want to continue following other stories of faith and overcoming, be sure to like this video and share it with those you love. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on any new content. Together, let's explore more powerful lessons from the Bible.